Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strategies for Analgesic Development and the new FDA Guidance for Analgesic Indications, presented by Roe. I'm Rebecca Friend, the publisher of the Life Sciences Group, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Brett Gordon, Project Director at Roe, and Ben Vaughn, Senior Statistical Scientist at Roe. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. We've got just a few technical notes before we begin. If you have any trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. Please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of the presentation. And we're going to be following the presentations today by a Q&A session. So please submit your questions during or after the presentation using the Q&A box at the right side of your window. All right, I think we're ready to begin. Ben, please go ahead.
Thanks, Rebecca. So the topics we're covering today is just a little bit of background regarding the guidance that recently came out. We're going to go through the guidance and just note some things that we see in there and how our experience gives us some ideas on where they're going with this and where they have how they got there. Also, one thing that we've seen a lot of recently is some interest in whether patient-reported outcomes should be collected on paper versus some of these new devices and technology. And finally, we're going to do a quick case study looking at recent analgesic approval. So for background, the prior guidance was from 1992. This is ancient in terms of regulatory. For context, OxyContin was approved in 1995. Following that, the 1998 effectiveness guidance kind of clarified the expectations for establishing efficacy and going to new populations, doses, regimens, or forms, but this was not specific to analgesia. And what had happened was there were very broad indications for some of these previously approved products. For example, NSAIDs are labeled for pain rather than anything more specific. And so the motivation for this guidance is to get into more specific indications for what the product has really demonstrated to be efficacious for. So the new draft guidance is really great. It's well organized. It has things mapped out in a very logical manner. There should be no surprises for sponsors that have had recent approvals, advisory committees, and phase 2 meetings. Everything in here is in line with what we've been seeing there. And as an aside, I would highly encourage everyone to, if you have a chance, attend an AdCom, listen in. There are you can get video over the web. It's not that expensive, or even go back through the minutes. The FDA really does reveal their thinking in these AdComs, and so it's certainly worth looking into it and trying to attend. The next analgesic one is in about 2 weeks. Then there's another one in late June and I think one in the fall. So try to get those on your calendar if you have time to attend. Again, the guidance is really well organized. The guidelines for establishing indications and claims are organized into new molecular entities, reformulation of approved products, and add-on or adjunctive indications, and some additional claims. And it's clear that the FDA has put a lot of thought into this. If you look back in 2010 in the Cymbalta AdCom, a lot of things that are in this guidance are kind of laid out and described there. At that time, they said that analgesic guidance was about 10 years overdue. That was 4 years ago, so a lot of thought has gone into it. And if you compare this to some other things that have been put out, for example, the summary level clinical site data guidance, that thing's a mess. There are inconsistencies even within the document. And by comparison, this is really well laid out. So I'm going to hand off to Brett, and he's going to speak about what you need to show for new molecular entities.
Hello, good afternoon. So as Ben said, I'm going to start by talking about the requirements for indications for new molecular entities. And this should really be fairly intuitive for any drug development program, not just for analgesics. But it does state in the guidance, of course, that the indications and usage section of the label should be supported by the specific conditions studied in the clinical study section of the label. So in other words, you can't go ahead and make broad claims about pain if your clinical studies don't necessarily support them. In general, for efficacy for an NME analgesic used to treat a specific pain indication, you'll need to show efficacy in at least 2 adequate and well-controlled studies. So one thing that I do want to note is that when I talk about studies or trials today, in general, I'm referring to adequate and well-controlled studies, meaning studies that are in randomized populations and are designed to establish superiority to either a placebo or an active control. From there, the requirements for NMEs really build in a logical manner. You have to start by meeting requirements for the narrower indications before moving on to try to claim anything in a broader indication. And a good way to think about this is an analogy, is like a game of Monopoly. Before you can put hotels on any property, you've got to go ahead and build houses first. Of course, all the requirements listed in the guidance document are minimum requirements. Additional trials may be needed, and we recommend frequent interaction and discussion with FDA to determine what those requirements might be. And then typically, when you're beginning a development plan for a new product, what you'll likely want to do is focus on getting an approval first for a specific indication and then slowly expanding into broader claims. And then as we go through the presentation today, we'll kind of go into how difficult it is to get indications for some of the fairly broad claims. So in general, the requirements, again, will build from narrow to broad. And an example of a narrow indication might be for establishing safety and efficacy in just a single condition. So for example, osteoarthritis or fibromyalgia. And again, 2 trials would be sufficient to support efficacy in a specific or narrow indication. Another example of a narrow indication might be a new route of administration for a drug. And this could be, for example, for a drug intended only for intrathecal therapy for chronic pain. There's a number of risks that would be associated with giving chronic intrathecal therapy, so your potential indication statement might even be as narrow as for the management of chronic pain in patients for whom intrathecal analgesic therapy is warranted. Breakthrough pain largely follows the same structure as narrow pain indications, in that you would only need 2 trials to get an indication. You can generally get in the indication in opioid-tolerant subjects that are experiencing persistent pain, otherwise controlled with maintenance doses of around-the-clock opioid therapy with therapy of at least 60 milligram morphine equivalents per day. Moving on to general acute pain. Here we begin to see the first general indications outlined in the new guidance that allow for some degree of generalizability. For the purposes of this guidance, acute pain is defined as pain that's self-limiting and generally requires treatment for no more than up to a few weeks. For general acute pain indication, you would need to conduct 2 trials in nociceptive pain, 1 in visceral pain, which might include a trial in, for example, acute pancreatitis, postoperative visceral surgery, and then 1 additional trial in non-visceral pain, which could be postoperative orthopedic surgery, fractures, or other acute musculoskeletal pain. One other point to note out is that if your drug is intended for outpatient use, that at least 1 of those trials would need to be conducted in an outpatient setting. And similarly, if it's going to be indicated for inpatient use, that you would conduct at least 1 trial in an inpatient setting. From here, we'll move on from acute to the chronic pain indications. And chronic pain, per the guidance, is defined as either pain persisting for longer than 1 month beyond resolution of the underlying event, or pain persisting beyond 3 months. So starting with neuropathic pain, potential indications could be characterized as either peripheral, central, or general neuropathic pain. Starting with peripheral neuropathic pain, which would include diabetic neuropathy, postherpetic neuralgia, HIV-associated pain, chemotherapy-associated pain, you would need 2 trials in 1 of those specific conditions to make a claim for that specific condition. From there, where it builds is that if you wanted to now claim a second condition, you would only have to do 1 trial, assuming that you've already established efficacy in the first. And then if you wanted to get a more general indication for peripheral neuropathic pain, you would have to do at least 1 trial in each of 3 conditions. Just as an example, I started looking through FDA's approvals database just to see what products are out there that might have some of the more generalizable indications. So far, I was unable to find anything that had a general peripheral neuropathic pain indication, although Lyrica or pregabalin comes fairly close. They were approved for painful diabetic neuropathy and then a second condition of postherpetic neuralgia. But again, they would still need a third condition in order to get that more generalizable label. So for example, if they had done an HIV-associated trial, which I actually believe they did at some point in time, but may not have actually been able to meet their primary endpoint on that, that would have given them the more generalizable label. So moving on to central neuropathic pain, again, you would have to do 2 trials in different conditions to get a more generalizable label of central neuropathic pain. This could be trials in spinal cord injury, post-stroke neuropathic pain, or pain with multiple sclerosis. And then for an even more general label of treatment of neuropathic pain, you'd have to meet the requirements for both general peripheral neuropathic pain and then do 1 additional trial in a central neuropathic pain condition, which would be for a total of 4 trials. Chronic musculoskeletal pain indications are actually fairly straightforward. You would have to do 2 trials in 1 indication for labeling in a single condition. If you wanted to get, again, a more general label of chronic musculoskeletal pain, you would have to do 1 additional trial in, 1 other condition in order to get that in your label. And then finally, to get a general indication of treatment of chronic pain, which I guess in some ways is almost the holy grail of analgesia drug development because it's so hard to achieve, you would have to meet the general neuropathic pain requirements. So as we already discussed, that would require you to do at least 4 trials. And then you would also have to cover non-neuropathic pain, which would require 2 trials in 1 condition, and then at least 1 trial in each of 2 other conditions, which could include osteoarthritis, low back pain, cancer pain, fibromyalgia, or chronic visceral pain. So in general, what that equates to is having to do 8 trials in 7 conditions. So I kind of liken this to, with the Monopoly example, I guess this would be if you could build something beyond hotels and probably do it on the boardwalk property.
My brother and I used to do that, take spare Legos and add them on, red Legos for more hotels. So for other scenarios, these are just kind of taking existing products and changing them a little bit. Reformulations of approved products, if you are going the 505(b)(2) route, 1 trial may be sufficient, and that would include modifying an immediate release product to get it long-acting extended release. 2 trials are going to be needed for new routes, new populations, new indications. So again, speak with the review division. There might be exceptions, and if you think that your product is just a minor change to something existing, or it's not that much of a reach to go to these new indications, then 1 trial may be sufficient. And for add-on adjunctive indications, your clinical trial really needs to match what the setting under which it's the indication that you're seeking with it. They have to really align. So if you're adding on something to subjects that are going to be on chronic opioids, you can expect your label to reflect that. For additional claims, we would recommend that you review the patient report outcome measures guidance. Establishing a new PRO can be difficult and expensive. FDA is fine with that, and they encourage that. They want to see more PROs to be validated and used, but it's difficult, and there's a lot involved, so certainly review that guidance. And the one other thing is, in developing these, you can recoup some costs simply because once it's established, other sponsors can use this, and there might be licensing revenue. So it might be worth the effort. And if you think that your product really it's better differentiated by something that's not out there, it's worth investigating. However, our recommendation would be if there's a reliable instrument out there, use it. Don't reinvent the wheel. It's certainly going to be a lot faster. Always discuss with the agency any intended claims. Earlier is better. If you just throw it in your submission and expect to get something, that rarely works. You really need to have some buy-in early from the agency. Also, as with any indication, you have to pre-specify everything. It needs to be adequate, well-controlled, and you need to have part of your statistical analysis plan needs to handle multiplicity. So you can't just find an additional thing that your product works on and attempt to make a claim on that. Also, the agency has a strong preference for multiplicity adjustments that are pre-specified as well. So something like Hochberg or Bronfrey Home, where it kind of adjusts to what you're seeing in the data really don't work. The preference I've heard most frequently stated is serial gatekeeping, which is pretty straightforward, which is you just specify the order that you're going to go through your claims, and once you reach one that doesn't meet significance, then you stop, and everything after that is declared insignificant. Once again, the agency encourages new instruments, but if there's something established and reliable, stick with that. Especially with pain, you need to minimize recall. You don't want to do pain relief because you have to think about how you're feeling previously. So that's usually not a good outcome, especially for a primary. Also, anything beyond 24 hours of recall for a pain intensity is not recommended. And if you are in a special population, pediatrics, where you have to use an observer reported outcome, it has to be something that's actual events, things that are observable. You can't have them rate how much pain you think they're in. It has to be based on something where you can specify they're crying, they're wincing, they're reacting somehow as the outcome. You really cannot get to intensity through an observer reported outcome. Composite scales that span multiple domains should be avoided. For example, in osteoarthritis, the WOMAC, the total WOMAC score would not be a good primary outcome. However, WOMAC pain would be fine, and this does compose of multiple questions. That's acceptable. They're all within the pain domain. But when you start combining pain, stiffness, everyday activities, that is not going to be a good primary outcome. However, it could be something that you would use as additional claims where your primary is pain, and then you kind of step down through the other WOMAC individual items, and then total WOMAC as a tertiary type of outcome. I've heard from statisticians at the FDA that they're starting to like the responder analyses. They tend to be low power, but it gets past a lot of the dropout and missing data problems. If someone drops out in an acute pain trial because they feel great, they're not taking any rescue medicine, they want to go home, that's a positive outcome, and you can report it as a success. If they drop out because they have tons of AEDs, they're constantly vomiting, that's a failure. And so with dropout, you can really dichotomize that into responder or non-responder. However, for continuous outcomes, you can't really say what their pain intensity was after they've dropped out. They also are encouraging you to try to get some sort of follow-up after dropout and incorporate that somehow. However, nailing them down on how you're supposed to incorporate that has been nearly impossible. Have not gotten really good and specific feedback on what to do there, but it's an idea that they like. And the last thing is pain intensity outcomes must take rescue medication into account. And this is one place where it is acceptable to still be doing lock-F for SPIDs, pain intensities. If you have a rescue medication, you can get the pain just prior to that and lock-F over the time that the rescue medication would have an effect. And that's last observation carried forward. So for safety, there really are no surprises in the guidance at all, especially if you've had recent feedback with the agency. Nothing in there raised our eyebrows. One thing to note is they suggest using naltrexone blocking in early phase testing. This is certainly a good idea, but there's a little bit of a risk. With opioids, they slow your GI motility. Naltrexone is going to reverse that to some degree. And if the uptake of your drug is in any way affected by food intake or just how it moves through your GI tract, the naltrexone might impact your PK results. So that's something you need to be aware of, possibly investigate. But they certainly recommend when you're doing your first in human, do the blocking on that with opioids. Follow-up periods for safety, almost all of these are going to expect that they go beyond wherever your primary efficacy endpoint is, and you should discuss with the agency if you need to do a long-term safety study. Nearly all analgesic products are going to have some abuse liability. You need to plan for this early in your development. They indicated rather strongly that they intend to require REMS for analgesic products where the risks are similar to the extended-release long-acting opioids. They did not get more specific, however. This is certainly something to keep an eye on, and the AdCom in 2 weeks is for an acute pain opioid product, so it's possible this may come up there, something to look for, but as of this time, they haven't been more specific. They're also expect to have post-marketing studies and further ongoing observation with all these products. And again, just speak with the agency about what their expectations are. And I'm going to go back to Brett for some trial considerations.
Okay, so as Ben noted, I'm going to address some additional trial considerations. And one of the most difficult challenge is in superiority trials of analgesics, as Ben kind of just referenced when he was talking about responder rates, are dropouts. You tend to get a lot of dropouts in chronic pain studies. First of all, because in order to meet the definition of chronic pain, you need to do a trial that lasts 12 weeks or 3 months. And you tend to get dropouts from both treatment arms. In your placebo-controlled or placebo arm, you're going to get dropouts for lack of efficacy. And then you'll tend to get dropouts in your treatment arm due to adverse events. And this, of course, will also lead to analysis issues with missing data. Ben's already touched on that a little bit this afternoon, and I believe he's going to speak on that a little bit more later on. But while admittedly a challenge, the guidance document does identify a number of approaches to help reduce dropouts, one of which is use of rescue meds. And again, as Ben had already alluded to, one thing that you can do is take assessments of pain just prior to issuing rescue meds. Another strategy is that you can also pre-specify a time prior to each pain assessment that rescue meds would be prohibited. You can also do add-on designs for your trials. So you can basically go ahead and add your therapy that you're looking at to an existing therapy that patients are already taking. One of the downsides to this, though, is that you might only wind up with an adjunct therapy label if you did not also do a monotherapy trial. You can also look at allowing for sufficient titration periods, especially with opioids. You want to make sure that your titration period is long enough that you can bring patients on slowly. This will also help to hopefully eliminate some dropouts that you might expect to see. Another consideration would be a titration to effect design. And in this type of study design, as opposed to a fixed dose design, you would actually have patients titrate up to an individually therapeutic dose. The downside of this would be that it would be hard to accurately identify a dose response because, of course, your pre-specified doses across groups wouldn't be available for comparison. Another potential design element that you can add is an enrichment design. This would remove subjects that are not candidates for the product prior to randomization. So only subjects that could be successfully titrated and meet a pre-specified criteria, such as a percentage reduction in pain from baseline, would be randomized to treatment or placebo. On a side note, while the guidance doesn't necessarily go into this, a similar design to enrichment would be to use a single-blind placebo-controlled run-in. While this won't necessarily help to address issues with dropouts, it can help weed out likely placebo responders and decrease placebo effect, which is a whole other issue that the guidance doesn't really go into except for two small references. The guidance addresses evaluation of both single and multi-dose characteristics and considerations for both. To fully characterize efficacy, FDA recommends evaluating single-dose characteristics, including time to onset of pain relief and time to rescue or remedication. This can be done in a single-dose trial or can be done around the first dose if you're doing this in a multi-dose trial. Unless the drug under study is intended for a single dose, multi-dose trials will need to be conducted to confirm efficacy over time. So starting with acute pain, for parenteral drugs used in postoperative period, the primary efficacy period should be no less than 24 hours for one trial and 48 hours for a second trial if required. For oral drugs, longer efficacy studies are encouraged and should have a follow-up period that parallels the planned usage. And to avoid interference with efficacy measures at scheduled times with use of rescue meds, pain assessments can be done at the current time with no recall period, and the primary efficacy endpoint can then be based on a time-weighted analysis over the trial period. With chronic pain, as we've already discussed or alluded to, I think a couple points, at 12-week minimum duration is expected. Again, with a 12-week trial, you can probably also expect relatively high rates of discontinuation due to adverse events or lack of efficacy. And then this can lead to difficulty in evaluating missing data, so you want to make sure that you have carefully considered missing data strategies. Again, I'll defer to Ben to that to talk about in a little bit more detail. With NMEs, you should also make sure that you have adequately explored in phase 2 the best approach to various trial designs that you would want to look at in phase 3. We highly recommend an end of phase 2 meeting with FDA so that the division can provide input into your best determined approach. There's also a number of population considerations that you'll want to take into account as well. Patient populations in phase 3 should represent as much as possible those patients that are reasonably expected to use the drug once it's marketed. So in some development programs, it may be useful for one trial to have a more narrowly defined entry criteria, and then you can allow for enrichment where possible. Well, if you're doing a second trial for the same indication, you may have broader criteria to better support generalizability. In situations where pain is related to systemic disease, you'll want to keep the underlying disease and other treatments stable. That's not necessarily anything that's specific just to analgesic studies. I've seen that in studies of pretty much all indications. And then if you're including subjects with prior substance abuse history, specific monitoring should be included. One of the population items to consider is sample size. This may be stepping on Ben's turf a bit, but in general, the size of the enrollment should be based on the number of subjects needed to demonstrate a meaningful difference in treatment arms and should not be so large as to give statistical significance to a difference in effect size that's too small to have clinical relevance. So in other words, in some cases, you might be able to essentially buy yourself statistical significance with a large enough sample size, but if your treatment difference is not clinically relevant, don't necessarily expect that you're going to get approval. That's about all I'm going to wind up saying on minimal clinically important difference today, as that could be the topic of an entire other webinar. You'll also want to take into account what you're doing with concomitant medications. PK or PD studies may be needed to characterize interactions between your investigational product and likely con meds that it would be taken with. If you allow continued use of other analgesic meds, other than rescue meds, of course, you may only be able to support an adjunct label. And then again, if you're allowing generally accepted analgesics, while this can mimic actual use of the drug in the real world, you risk creating an imbalance of con meds across treatment groups, so you might want to consider stratification of your randomization based on what con meds the patients are taking when they enter the trial. And then similar to how we would recommend handling drug therapies, if patients are taking any non-drug therapies, these should also be stable prior to the trial and should ideally go unchanged during the trial. I'm not going to spend that much time talking about pediatric populations, but in general, it's an unmet need, and sponsors are encouraged to perform trials to support pediatric indications. The guidance does go on to explain that extrapolation of efficacy data from adult trials may be appropriate down to 2 years of age, and you would only require PK and safety studies in these instances. For children under 2, full efficacy, safety, and PK studies would be recommended. There's some additional guidance documents that are out there that talk specifically about pediatrics. One is the Pediatric Research and Equity Act, which this guidance document references, and then you can also reference the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, which provides an incentive for drug companies to conduct FDA-requested pediatric studies and by granting an additional 6 months of marketing exclusivity if it's an NME. So when you're looking at what comparators to use in your study, first of all, I should probably start by saying, and I think we've again alluded to this a couple times today, that you need to be conducting a superiority trial. The guidance has made it clear that superiority trials, as opposed to say a non-inferiority trial, are what's going to be able to get you the specific claim that you're looking for. So if you have a couple options here. One, of course, is your placebo-controlled arm. Another option would be to use a lower dose of the investigational drug. Now, let's say that you used a lower dose of a comparator drug. One thing that you need to be cognizant of is that you're likely not going to be able to make any sort of head-to-head claim about your drug versus its effect against the comparator drug if the comparator drug was used at a subtherapeutic dose. The other thing that FDA is encouraging now is to go ahead and use an active comparator where possible, because the active comparator can provide additional information on assay sensitivity in a given trial, which can be helpful in distinguishing if your trial doesn't show significance based on either lack of efficacy or if it was a failed trial because of problems with the design. I'm going to turn it back over to Ben to talk about specific pain outcome measures.
Okay, and the guidance really lays these out in a nice list for you. First and foremost is pain intensity. These are analgesics. You should have a response on pain. The major difficulty with analgesia is that pain response has to be patient-reported. You can use a numeric response scale or a visual response scale, which is a 100-millimeter line where they just mark off on there how much pain they're in. It can be categorical, mild, moderate, severe, and each of these have advantages and disadvantages. This is what phase 2 is for. Prior approvals look at what your drug really distinguishes itself on. If there are disease-specific instruments, absolutely use that. WOMAC is a good example, again, for osteoarthritis pain. It really gets to the issues that that population has, so it's a good outcome for OA. And other therapeutic areas have similar scales. Function is good for a secondary. It's not something that you're going to want to have as a primary. It's perfect for supporting evidence, and the pain may be impacting subjects in both emotional and physical function, but again, your primary needs to be related to analgesia specifically. And the FDA really does encourage new instruments. Try to establish new PROs if you really think that your product distinguishes itself in some way. However, if there are existing instruments, go with those. For quality of life, I would just say don't expect much. They welcome it as an exploratory endpoint. You're not going to get claims on this, and simply because it's multi-domain, it's a little fuzzy, it's not clear what it's measuring, but if you have something interesting there, it's sure, include it, report it, but the agency is probably not going to let you make any claims there. With rescue medication, it needs to be specific, specific, specific. If it's allowed, you have to record it. You have to know exactly when it was given. You need to list off what drugs are allowed. You need to have an algorithm for when they're allowed to take it. Once they reach a certain pain, if it's been a certain number of hours. Again, be very, very specific with rescue medication. Make sure you get the collection done properly. And the main concern here is that what you might be measuring is the effect of the rescue medication instead of the effect of your product. So again, be very, very specific, pre-specify things, make sure it's collected well. For global impressions of improvement, global impressions of the current state, anything like this are pretty problematic. The agency does not care for them. Again, it's multidimensional, and it's really not clear what you're collecting. You could be just seeing that they like the product because the last one made them nauseous, whatever they were on previously, whereas the next subject is really getting a lot of pain relief. So there's this high degree of variability between subjects and what they're actually saying, what they're reporting when they have a good outcome or a poor outcome. So the agency doesn't really care for global assessments. Another outcome might be opioid sparing. This could be good evidence of efficacy, but you need to show that them taking less opioids actually has some other benefit. For example, they're experiencing less nausea, constipation, vomiting, diarrhea, your standard opioid AEs. If you can show that they're improving on these other things as a result of the reduction in opioids, that's an evidence, but simply using less is not going to get you a claim. For sleep, this is something where you need to use an established instrument, the Leeds Sleep Evaluation Questionnaire. This is an example of this. The claim needs to be clinically and statistically meaningful, and it can't just be as a result of the analgesic effect. It's not, if you're going to get a sleep claim, it needs to be not just because they have reduced pain and they're able to sleep. So moving on to statistical considerations. The guidance here, again, no surprises at all in a number of these things. Many of these that are spelled out here are what you'd expect from any well-controlled phase 3 trial. Should always have a single primary pre-specified analysis where you have a go, no go, we have success. That needs to be spelled out, and that's true for nearly any phase 3. The analyses should really describe the drug's efficacy in a complete manner, effect size, variability, onset, duration. Responder analyses, I'm seeing a trend where the agency likes these for the reasons I mentioned earlier, which is that it gets around the dropout problems in some ways, but you have lower power because you're ironing over, you can have very positive outliers, very negative outliers, and you just might lose some power there. One other thing that is mentioned in this guidance is possibly including a cumulative distribution function plot. I do not agree with this. I spent about 3 months last year helping sponsor prep for an advisory committee meeting where the primary outcome was a CDF-based analysis, and these were very bright people, and it was very difficult to wrap your head around a CDF. And so as a package insert for physicians or patients, it can be informative, but it's difficult to interpret. And what that is it just shows for a given improvement, what percentage of subjects had that improvement. But it involves kind of looking across one axis, tracing up to a line, and seeing where that intersects with the other axis. And it can be a little confusing, and there's not necessarily a standard for which access goes where, the direction. So they can be confusing. It's hard to wrap your head around it. The sponsor did their CDFs in one direction. The FDA did the CDFs in the opposite direction. We spent a lot of time flipping ours around and really hoped the FDA wasn't doing the same thing and flipping theirs around prior to the advisory committee meeting. But they can be a little confusing, but it does allow you to see the full distribution of the data. Again, this would be, some of these other things on here would be considered for any phase 3 good practice. You need to include descriptive statistics for anything clinically relevant. Always have some way of seeing the variability, box plots, the CDFs, standard deviations. This is just good statistical practice. If there's not an established clinical significance for your primary outcome, use conservative estimates wherever possible. This is not something out of the guidance. This is just my personal recommendation. For example, SPIDs. There's not a really good clinical significance already established. And so if you use a conservative estimate, like Brett was saying earlier, you can kind of get away with buying a p-value. Now, you can't lie to the agency. You can't report much larger standard deviations than what you actually saw when you're doing your power calculations. But if you just use the most conservative possible at every point, it'll get you to a believable yet larger sample size, which gives you greater statistical power and a greater likelihood of actually having a significant outcome. Again, be perfectly honest about this. Don't try to deceive the FDA, but you can sneak it by. And the reason for this is just that the cost of a failed trial is far, far, far greater than adding a few more subjects to a given clinical trial. For missing data, single imputation is no longer acceptable. A couple years back, the document that I've noted there, the Prevention and Treatment of Missing Data in Clinical Trials, came out. The rollout on this at the FDA was less than ideal. It pretty much involved them sending it to everyone who might have a trial that would be impacted by this, with a message that more or less said, do what we say in this document, and no further guidance. And there hasn't been much additional guidance since then, but things are starting to come out. Certainly avoid single imputation. Mixed models, multiple imputation, pattern mixture, selection models are recommended. Responder analysis, as I mentioned, is a way to bypass this. But the real difficulty is the method must be pre-specified. And the methodology that gets around data that are not missing at random can be rather hard to pre-specify. Pattern mixture models, you really have to say what your patterns are going to be, and that can be difficult in a lot of settings where you just don't know precisely what the mechanisms of missingness are prior to actually running the trial. An exception might be chronic pain with opioids. This is a pretty well-described population. The reasons for dropout are pretty well known. You're looking at adverse events due to the opioids, a lack of efficacy, things like that. So it's a little better known there, and it actually can be pre-specified there. But if you're talking about oncology pain, it can be very difficult because they're dropping out for any number of reasons, some of which have nothing to do with the product, and it's just really hard to get that pre-specified. And one other thing is when I say no lockout, there are situations where it makes sense. As I mentioned earlier, looking at SPIDs where you take the rescue medication, lock-upping across the duration of the rescue med is perfectly acceptable, and this is the methodology that FDA has been telling some sponsors to use. It's fine there, so it's not just a blanket rejection of doing single imputation. It's just it needs to make sense for your particular situation. Okay, so we're going to move on to tablets and e-devices versus paper. And so there's been a lot of new technology and a lot of interest in this. Some examples are voice response systems using the web to respond, tablets both in clinic, at home, and just having smartphone apps where the patients are able to report their pain intensities. This is great for daily type of data, but there are advantages and disadvantages. So the major advantages of electronic collection is that the data are available almost instantly. You can monitor your data almost in real time. It's available right then. You can also program the devices to trigger alarms to prompt the patients. An IVRS can call them at home or on a cell phone. You get much more consistent in time of collection, and you have less missing data when they're actually prompted. Diary data on paper is terrible, and anytime you have to have a subject fill out a date, it will be wrong. And somebody has to go back through and clean these things up. You can also put instructions into the device to guide those subjects so you get more consistency there. The site staff doesn't have to key the data and manually measure VAS scores. Again, 100 millimeter VAS, if it's done on paper, somebody has to sit there with a ruler and measure it off. And also with that, you get digit bias, which I'll come to later. Some of the disadvantages are that you have to train the staff, you have to retrain them, you have to remind them that they actually have the devices and they can't use the backup paper copies instead. It can be very costly, and you have to re-educate them over and over and over again. The device has to be validated, again adding cost. Just the cost of the device itself. Also, in older populations, they might not be comfortable with a smartphone or with a tablet. They might be shaky and have trouble, really precisely putting a mark. Another problem is that, for example, with a VAS where you're marking off on the line, pen is going to be a very precise, thin mark, whereas on a tablet, you're putting your big fat sausage fingers on there, trying to get to a particular point. Now, the devices do allow you to, or some devices do allow you to you make your initial mark and then you can kind of slide it back and forth if it's not precisely where you wanted it. And how that works is for 100 millimeter VAS, there's 101 stops from 0 to 100. So the actual size on the screen might not be 100 millimeters, but there's an equivalent number of stopping points. And the biggest difficulty with electronic devices is that they break. The batteries run down, people drop them, they reboot for no reason. So there are some difficulties just with any new technology, and that can mean downtime. You can have someone leave the clinic because they're not hanging around for it, and that can lead to missing data for a different reason. So just really quickly, digit bias. This is something that's fascinating as a statistician, usually does not impact a trial, but basically people like certain numbers and they will over-report them. This applies both to site staff when they're actually measuring a VAS. They will over-report multiples of 5. If you have a 44 or a 46, you'd expect it to show up in the data the same amount of times as a 45. It doesn't. The 45 always shows up more often. And in terms of your estimates, doesn't matter. In terms of the variability, it can mess up your variability just a little bit. Same thing for numeric response scale. You can see where it's not uncommon for subjects just to report the same 2 or 3 numbers. And part of the problem with NRS, and this applies to both paper and tablets if you actually have the numbers on there, is subjects can recall from day to day what they reported the previous day. And so will it mess up your response? Perhaps, maybe not. But it does certainly push down the variability because subjects are just reporting, this pain feels about the same, and so you have a recall, whereas their actual pain levels could be creeping down, but they still perceive them the same because they're just recalling the same numbers over and over again. So the key considerations in terms of electronic versus paper collection is talk to your sites. Are they comfortable and experienced with the device? What devices have they used previously? What has their experience been with them? Again, take that feedback with a little bit of a grain of salt, simply because these devices are kind of like flying. It can only be bad. You don't have a really great experience with them, but when things go wrong, people really do remember it. But just getting the site feedback and seeing how they feel about the devices in your particular population is really good to know. Again, it's a subject population comfortable for this. If you're talking about older subjects which might have other conditions, which would make it holding and filling out a device difficult, maybe it's not the best thing for them. If it's also, are you talking about daily measures or in clinic, and how many outcomes are going to be collected? These are our other considerations. Just fatigue with filling things out, and with daily measures, having that e-device is nice because it's prompting them every day to get it in there, and it'll have the correct date on the data. Okay, I'm going to hand it back to Brett to quickly have a case study for Cymbalta.
Yeah, so Ben's already mentioned Cymbalta with reference to the AdCom earlier on, but I did want to go through and just give this as kind of an example or case study just to show where this fits in with the overall picture of trials that you would need to do to get various pain indications. So first of all, Cymbalta, similar to Lyrica that I had already talked a little bit earlier, has been approved for a number of indications, both analgesic and psychiatric. So their original indication was actually for major depressive disorder back in 1994. And then later on, I guess they realized that it could also be developed for treatment of neuropathic pain as well. So there were 2 trials that were done in diabetic painful neuropathy, and Cymbalta was able to get into their label at that point, again, based off 2 trials for a single narrow condition, a diabetic painful neuropathy indication. 2007, they got an indication for generalized anxiety disorder, which has nothing to do with this guidance document. But again, just wanted to point that out. And then in 2009, they got approval for fibromyalgia. Again, that was another narrow or specific indication, and there were 2 trials that were used, or at least 2 trials that were used to support that particular claim. In 2010, it got a little bit more interesting because that's now where we see the first, I guess, more general or generalizable indication. So trials were done in both chronic low back pain and in osteoarthritis. But instead of getting 2 individual indications, one for chronic low back pain and one for osteoarthritis, this actually met the criteria for a more general label of overall chronic musculoskeletal pain. So looking at kind of where we are with trials right now with Cymbalta, they've got indications for peripheral neuropathic pain and fibromyalgia, as well as a more general indication for chronic musculoskeletal pain. So the question is why wasn't this enough to warrant a yet broader label for chronic pain? So if you look back to the requirements, of course, for a label of treatment of chronic pain, you would have to meet first the non-neuropathic criteria, which would be at least 4 trials in 3 conditions. And in this case, Cymbalta would actually meet this because they've got indications for fibromyalgia and then also have done the trials in low back pain and osteoarthritis. And then to meet the criteria for general neuropathic pain, they would need 1 trial in a central neuropathic pain condition, which currently they don't have. And then for the peripheral neuropathic pain indication, they meet this in part by having 2 trials done in diabetic painful neuropathy, but would still need 1 additional trial in each of 2 other conditions. So the bottom line is that for an overall indication of treatment of chronic pain, they would still need to do trials in, or a minimum of at least 3 other trials. So this diagram, in some ways I actually wish I had put a little bit earlier in the presentation now because it may have helped kind of illustrate this when we were going through what trials you need to do for what. And I admit this may not be 100% perfect, but at least I think I'm a more visual learner. So when I was going through the guidance document, it helped me greatly to kind of map this out on paper. But again, you can use this as a tool to see what trials are needed for everything from acute pain to chronic pain, and then the various sub-indications for chronic pain. And then as a last discussion today, I did want to just kind of give an example of a compare and contrast of CDER versus CDRH. So at the outset of this discussion, we noted that this is a guidance document that was issued by CDER and as such does not cover medical devices. But there are actually medical devices that are indicated for treatment of pain. There are a number of products on the market right now. There are hyaluronic acids or viscosupplementation. They're given by intra-articular injection into the knee. And it's just kind of a coincidence. Monovisc was approved by CDRH in February of 2014, which is the same exact month that the guidance document that we've been talking about today was issued. This is a particularly interesting approval because, again, first of all, it's indicated for the treatment of pain and osteoarthritis. So if you were following the CDER guidance, you would have expected that at least 2 trials would have been done in osteoarthritis. However, only 1 trial was done in support of the initial PMA submission. And then if you look at that 1 trial and whether it actually demonstrated superiority, because again, the CDER guidance establishes that you need to have a superiority trial, interestingly enough, it actually did not meet its primary effectiveness endpoint. Yet they were able to get approval in 2014, and this was after completing a total of 0 new trials for that indication. So you might be asking yourself, well, how did CDRH grant approval for Monovisc, seeing that it had failed its 1 trial and its 1 primary endpoint? So the answer was that they allowed them to do a non-inferiority comparison. And it was actually a non-inferiority comparison that was done on a post hoc analysis, and it was a post hoc analysis of historical data. So Orthovisc is another product which was given in 3 doses. And just for additional background, Monovisc is basically Orthovisc given in a single dose. So you take the 3 syringes, you put them into 1 syringe, and you give it at 1 time. So they did a non-inferiority analysis against the old Orthovisc data to establish non-inferiority, which then it even gets a little bit more interesting because if you go back to the original Orthovisc approval, 3 trials were completed to try to establish efficacy for that original indication of pain. They demonstrated superiority again for approximately no trials, did a combined effectiveness subgroup analysis, and were able to get an approval. So long story short, what would CDER do? And this is really a rhetorical question because obviously they probably would not have gotten approved if this were going to CDER. But again, hopefully after listening to today's talk, you all now have a better understanding of the requirements for analgesic development for FDA's new guidance document. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it back to our moderator and open the floor for questions. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and move on to Q&A now. We've just got a couple of minutes for Q&A, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So here you go. I'll put this out to either one of you. Do you need to include a dose response in any of the individual specific pain trials for FDA approval?
Yes. That's an easy one. You certainly are going to need to establish, and typically that's going to be in your phase 2 is where you're really looking for that dose response. But you do need to have that curve well established because with these products, frequently it's a trade-off between safety and efficacy. And so you need to know where you're getting effective dosage with acceptable safety, and without doing some dose response, you're just not going to have that.
Okay, great. Again, we'll try to get another one in here. To obtain a claim for general peripheral neuropathic pain, does it assume replicated studies in one condition?
And that was one place we were kind of looking at it too, and it was the one place where we saw in that kind of, and if you look at Brett's map, where you don't need the houses for the hotel necessarily, in monopoly speak. It appears that if you do 3 trials in 3 separate indications, you can get there without first having achieved that narrow indication in a single one. Brett, got something to add?
Yeah, I mean, and the only thing that I'll add to that is that, so what Ben said is completely correct, but then again, if you look at the historical approvals of products that are on the market right now, I believe the two indications that are regularly seen are for either diabetic neuropathy or for postherpetic neuralgia, and I don't think anybody has been able to establish efficacy in that third condition, whether it's HIV-related neuropathy or chemotherapy-related neuropathy. So I think it's, I don't know if it's something with the condition where it's just, again, been harder to establish efficacy in those, but there hasn't been anything to date that's been able to establish efficacy in that third condition.
So possible, but also
possible, but some risk, exactly.
Okay, great. I think we've got time for just one more question, so this will be the last one, but here we go. Can you comment on the FDA's views related to the use of a placebo versus active comparator?
And I think we addressed some of that. With an active comparator, you need to have the expectation that you can show superiority. So it's probably going to be at a lower dose of most active comparators or something that's not as a heavy-hitting product. The agency does not care for non-inferiority. They are pushing hard that these need to be superiority trials. And so it's a question of, can you design a trial that's ethical with a placebo, or just it's a matter of logistics. Can you get a reasonable active comparator that works for your indication, yet you can still expect to see superiority?
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add. Again, just going back to my example, I mean, I think if this were a device trial that you were talking about, sure, CDRH would support a study of non-inferiority with an active comparator. CDER right now, like Ben said, is really pushing for superiority over placebo, although they are asking for active comparators where possible, again, just to get more information in your trial design.
Yeah, and also doing equal analgesic doses, having an active comparator in there also gives you a picture of, if you want to make that head-to-head comparison down the line and gain more information, doing it initially pre-approval, you're probably not going to come out of the gates with any kind of claims against an active comparator at an equal analgesic dose, but it's certainly good information to kind of build up for future studies.
Okay, great. Well, unfortunately, we have a lot of really good questions. I wish we had time for some more, and wanted to let everyone know that we will be able to get back to everyone individually if you submitted a question and we haven't covered it here. But otherwise, I want to thank you all for attending this Fierce Live webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating, and want to thank Ro for participating or for presenting today's webinar. The webinar has been recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page that you used to register for the event. We look forward to seeing you at future events.